So, right now, something, maybe many things, are happening in Asia. They aren't flashy, and it isn't necessarily obvious at first glance. But if you look closer, you can see the beginnings of a shift that could leave, of all countries, Russia in a worst case scenario, more isolated than at any other point since the end of the Cold War. For decades, Moscow has positioned itself as an effective bridge between India and China, the indispensable third partner that could balance one against the other. But in recent months, weeks, even days, that balance has slowly started to tilt. India and China are slowly learning to re-engage, to directly talk, and Russia's role as an effective mediator is quietly evaporating. Now, what we're talking about here is a possibility, not a certainty. It certainly is clear that Putin, Modi, and Xi are on close terms after the images at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But nothing in geopolitics is guaranteed. And, well, in a worst case scenario, signs would point to a certain direction, which for Moscow would look very precarious. So in this more speculative video, I wanted to consider how what's happening right now between India and China could impact Russia, what it could mean for Putin's ambitions, why it would matter for the world, and what might come next if Russia really were to be potentially sidelined in its new focus area.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where we are returning to the trilateral engagements between India, China, and Russia, something many of you have been very interested in about and requested more of a deeper dive. So this video is a bit more speculative, but if you want more of a substantive one about the India-China relationship specifically and the impact of Trump's tariffs, then check that out here. What do you think about this? Could Moscow really, in a hypothetical scenario, be at risk of being cut out of Asia's future? Or would it find a way to sort of leverage that? Let me know in the comments. Now, to understand this idea at the moment, let's consider some historical context. Russia's vision of the multipolar world has always rested on India and China. Then Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov floated the idea of a Russia-India-China alliance as a counterweight to the United States, which at that point was the undisputed, not superpower, but hyperpower. It was by far the most powerful country in every single metric you can consider. However, on paper, this new trilateral alliance would be formidable. 3 nuclear powers, more than 2 billion people at the time, and vast economic potential. But beneath the surface, it never really worked. India and China, mistrusted each other significantly. They clashed repeatedly along their 3,500 kilometer Himalayan border and even fought a war in 1962. For decades, the Soviet Union, or specifically Moscow, profited from that mistrust, selling arms to India, reassuring Beijing, and making itself geopolitically indispensable, diplomatically indispensable. But as the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia's overall international stature wobbled or declined, and China's rose with its own territorial ambitions, as well as India's recent rise under Modi's premiership, that has all changed. And the reasons lie not just in Moscow, but in Washington and Beijing as well. There are, of course, multiple different narratives and perspectives when it comes to how the past 20 to 30 years have played out with the balances of power. In some camps, people argue that the West and Russia could have been much closer, a particular golden age in the early 2000s, such as when Putin pledged support to NATO and the United States after 9/11. However, that the West's subsequent treatment of Moscow, such as with the ostracizing, sidelining, removal of Moscow from blocs like the G8, made Moscow reconsider its options, pivoting more towards China and Asia as a counterbalance. On the other hand, though, people argue that it is Putin's revisionist or revanchist policies that made the West, sideline him for fear that he would continue to put force, the use of might is right approach, on former Soviet Union states to, remain under the sphere of influence of Russia. These revisionist, revanchist policies that make its, Putin specifically and his interests much more aligned to that of President Xi over, say, Taiwan or China's near abroad, and why India feels that China is a growing and continual perpetual threat to its national and strategic interests. The point is that things have changed, and obviously when Trump entered office in his first term, his very unique approach to foreign policy made every country that, well, great power or not, have to reconsider their relations, recalibrate. But especially in his second term, with Trump's more, well, seemingly confidence, but also the war in Ukraine and overall just international disorder, things are changing even faster. President Trump has, well, specifically been frustrated at his inability to end the war in Ukraine, turning his anger to many nations, but including that of India. He has accused Delhi of being, well, a Kremlin laundromat, pointing to the surge in Russian oil imports from just 3% in 21 to more than 40% today. And then, of course, there are the tariffs, those 50% duties on Indian exports, which have already had significant impact on the Indian economy, but also the perception of the United States as not just a reliable partner, but a reliable leader, and why India and China are suddenly cozying up, well, however tentatively that may be. At the same time, China has, well, escaped punishment, despite buying even greater volumes of Russian crude oil and supplying Moscow with more than 80% of dual-use components it needs for its war machine. Beijing has been effectively given a pass. And in August, China's top diplomat Wang Yi told European officials outright that Russia cannot be allowed to lose. Conversely, India, meanwhile, has tried to stay balanced. Modi reminded Putin that this is not an era of war. He has travelled to Kiev last year to signal that Delhi was no dog in the fight. But, well, with pictures of him giving hugs to Putin, including them sharing a limo ride, and with Washington punishing India and Beijing backing Moscow, Delhi is having to reconsider and maybe is more keen to be open to Moscow's perspective of things, given the antagonism shown by the West or the United States more specifically. And that's where things get interesting. Because rather than leaning on Russia to mediate, India and China are beginning to test the waters of a direct reset. They've opened visa channels, restarted talks on demarcating their disputed border, and appeared together at summits without avoiding one another. It doesn't mean that their rivalry is over, but it does suggest that they're willing to explore enough engagement on their own terms, with, well, Moscow having very little to do and, well, not even just figuratively hold their hands. For Moscow, this is deeply unsettling. Its position as a peace broker is, well, fading. The Xi-Modi meeting in Kazan may have been staged at Putin's request, but Wang Yi's August trip to Delhi showed that Russia is no longer indispensable. And the imagery of Modi with Xi, and of course Putin there as well, it's still though significant since it's his first time in 7 years. It signals just how serious both sides are about moving forward bilaterally. Now, historically, India and Russia have been remarkably reliable partners. From the Cold War era through to the 21st century, Moscow could count on New Delhi for armed purchases, diplomatic support, and a sense of solidarity against Western dominance. That long record of cooperation has anchored the relationship for decades. But in recent years, Western ostracism, as I mentioned before, of Russia has pushed Putin even deeper into China's embrace. The Sino-Russo axis is central to the Kremlin's survival and, well, counter-narratives. And if Moscow were to forced to choose between its two major Asian partners, it would be hard to see how it could sacrifice Beijing's economic lifeline. Now, again, I want to stress that that is an extreme case scenario, but it is still very possible in geopolitics. That dilemma only makes, therefore, Russia's current predicament more acute. Moreover, the reason why I thought this was worth a video is because the data backs this up. According to SIPRI, India was the world's second largest arms importer between 2020 and 2024, with 36% of all those imports coming from Russia. But delays in delivering S-400 systems, the performance or not of Russian equipment on the battlefield in Ukraine, and also other embarrassments elsewhere, including such as the performance of Chinese-made military equipment in other parts of the world, have undermined confidence in Russian hardware, particularly, for example, in the case of the Kashmir clashes with Pakistan. France and Israel are now stepping in providing more military arms towards India. And if India begins sourcing advanced systems from China itself in another scenario, well, it would represent the ultimate reversal. Moscow's sidelined from the very market it once dominated. Economically, the story is no better. Russia's trade with China surpassed 200 billion last year. The yuan has replaced the dollar in nearly all transactions. UnionPay is replacing Visa and MasterCard. Moscow is now the junior partner, so dependent on Beijing's good and economic will. For India, the calculation is slightly different, though. America remains its largest export market, worth about 78 billion in 2024. Trade with China and Russia is only a fraction of that, which means Delhi has strong reasons to hedge, not to commit to Moscow's vision of a new US anti-bloc. And for Washington, here lies the irony. Punishing India risks driving it closer to China, the very outcome US policy has always sought to avoid, and they're therefore actually something that Putin would be wary of too. So where does this go? Well, one possibility is the so-called Primakov triangle is revived. Lavrov has insisted that time has come for that revival. Beijing nods along, saying it could uphold peace and stability. But these are, of course, just words. The reality is more fragile, a marriage of convenience rather than trust, especially when it comes to China and India, at least in the short term. The deeper trend is that India and China are learning to manage their disputes directly. Talks on border demarcation are back on the table. Visa restrictions are easing, and the optics are improving. It doesn't erase those decades of mistrust, but it does make Russia's role increasingly redundant and, well, a bit more of a headache for the United States as well. And of course, looming in the background is Trump's own strategy, the idea of a reverse Kissinger, pulling Russia back towards the West. He's already said Russia's expulsion from the G7 was a mistake. And if Moscow were to take that bait or feel that they didn't have as much option in a sort of rapprochement between India and China, well, that would leave Russia even more isolated and Putin wondering what he should do. So what once looked like a formidable anti-US bloc is in fact riddled with contradictions. India depends on US markets in technology. China leans on Pakistan and distrusts Delhi. And Russia? Well, it's more like a supplicant than strategist at this point. We know just how well Putin is as a master strategist in the war in Ukraine. It doesn't mean, though, Washington can relax or that anything is fixed. Even a temporary alignment of these three giants would shake the world, but the cracks between them run deeper, and, well, it still would be a problem for Moscow just based purely on the numbers. The nightmare is simple, that the dragon and the elephant no longer need the bear. Now, my name is Pyotr Kurzin. I am half Russian, half English, having studied in the West, but also across non-Western countries in the areas of strategic studies and economic statecraft. I've lived across Africa, Eastern Europe, and other parts, and I try to cut through the noise and tell it like it is, with data, context, and a bit of perspective. If you'd like to support my work, then do consider liking and subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this, including me interviewing varying degrees of opinion, be them from people from Russia, India, China, but of course also Western ones. And I'll see you all in the next one, which, well, you should make sure you watch this video to see how this all plays out in the context of trade.